Welcome to the second topic of our genetics unit. We're going to be talking about chromosomes and human inheritance. When Mendel discovered the idea of the gene, or that particle that transferred genetic information from generation to generation, he didn't know about the structure of what this was. He didn't even know what it was. He just knew that it had to exist, and he called it a factor. Later on, as we discovered the idea of a gene and chromosomes, we came to call the study of this genetics. And Mendel's particle of genetics was basically DNA. DNA is the molecule that makes us who we are. It has a large role, at least, in making us who we are, along with the environment. But in this video lecture series, we're going to be talking about why are we the way we are? Why are we different from other organisms? Why are we the same in some ways to other organisms? What makes us human? What makes us different from other humans? Why is there so many differences between us? We're going to talk about the chromosomal theory of inheritance and the history of its discovery, the idea of linked genes and sex-linked genes, Thomas Morgan, Alfred Stewart Vaught. We're going to talk about pedigrees and also about extranuclear genes, or genes that do not necessarily obey Mendel's laws of inheritance, blood types, mutations, abnormalities, genetic disorders, the structure of the human chromosome, and chromosomal genetics, and things like that. It's going to be an interesting topic, and I hope you guys are excited for that. For starters, and to give you guys a general idea of what is so interesting about this topic, let's think about the idea of the human race. And by human race, I mean the collective human species, which is Homo sapiens sapiens, which evolved less than 200,000 years ago, according to modern scientists. Now, when we look around us and around the world, we see people that have different facial structures, they have different skin color and eye color and hair color, and we have arbitrarily almost selected that people with a certain pattern or matching patterns of skin, hair, facial structure, skin color, and another series of traits are considered to be a race. And so we separate things like the Aryan race from the Mongolian race, or the Asian races, or Filipinian race, or Hispanic, or black, Caucasian. These are all concepts that we use in modern society and culture to determine differences between members of the human species. But when we ask as scientists how much difference there really is between members of the same species, well, by definition, any member of the human race, and I mean now as in all of the members of the human species, that is fertile and already mature enough, can theoretically have sex with another member of the species and produce viable offspring. That means that we are all the same species. No matter what race we are all humans, all Homo sapiens sapiens, and we are definitely different because of those mutations we're going to be talking about in this video lecture series, but we are the same. In fact, until recently, we realized that there's very, very little difference between the DNA of one human and another. And now, some food for thought here. You can actually do an analysis between the DNA differences between two members of supposedly of two different races, and find out that they are actually more similar than members of the same race could be similar. In other words, just because I'm white, I can actually be closer to someone who's black than somebody else who's white. Just because the person has a different skin color, it does not necessarily mean that I am more different from her or him than I am from a person of my same skin color. In fact, skin color is only a cluster of 6 genes or so. A cluster of several genes. And so, if you think about that way, what is human races? Is there really a difference between humans? Oh, of course there is, because you can see the variation caused by thousands of years of mutations gather into patterns that makes us different from each other. However, clearly, the separation of races is sometimes social, political, arbitrary decisions, because genetically, there doesn't seem to be that much difference between two members of different races. However, prior to the globalization of the human society, there was some isolation among human populations, leading to the clustering of some traits in some genetic groups of genes are linked within the human genome. So, for example, you do see those patterns of red hair, people with the freckles. You see patterns of types of hair, texture, and skin color, things like that. And those are just examples. There are definitely clusters of traits surrounding this idea of race. So I'm not saying there aren't races. I'm just saying that it's not as that easy to identify them. Because when you look at morphological differences between members of the human species, there are a lot of variations even within the same, theoretically, the same race. Look at people that are considered black. There are so many variations within that what is really to be black or to have that race. Racial identity is more of a social mental construct than it is an actual biological construct. Because if you look at it biologically, it's much more complicated to actually separate one race from the other. In fact, looking at it biologically, you can only find up to a 12% difference between members of two different races. And this is in current research. That could be more, could be less. Other numbers have said something less than 0.9%, depending on what you look at. If you look at restriction length polymorphisms, which is, you learn about that in AP biology, but it's basically fragments of different lengths in different people, you can see that's actually about 0.9%. But most other studies that looked at other pieces of the DNA have shown differences of as much as 12% between members of different races. But you are 50% different from your brother. So what is a 12% difference? That doesn't seem much. And so if you think about it that way, DNA differences are not enough to classify races. And if you look at a morphological difference, like I said, it doesn't have a clear-cut definition of what's black, what's white, what's Aryan, what's Asian, what's Polynesian, what's Mongolian, what is race is a hard concept to get through. And so I leave you with this thought. Since it is so hard to both morphologically or genetically determine the idea or the conceptual idea of human race, why are we so bound on setting differences between us? Certainly, there seems to be clustering of traits among people of a certain race. But even then, you can't deny that we are much the same. But we are also different. And what are those differences caused by? They're caused by mutations of whatever was the original version of a certain gene. Or by problems with the structure of the chromosomes. So for example, when you have a structural problem like non-disjunction, we talked about meiosis, leading to things like Down syndrome, that's causing disorders. Also, mutations in one gene can cause problems, like for example what happens with albinism, when people are incapable of generating pigmentation on their skin, their hair, or sometimes even their eyes. And so, we are different from each other because we gather these mutations. But whether these things are actually disorders that cause problems or are going to be advantageous, it all depends on the environment that we have, including the social environment. So let me put it to you this way. Is there enough difference between a black person and a white person? Is there enough difference between you and your brother? It's all the same question, really. And since these genetic differences are not substantial enough for us to be called a different species, and even if we were a different species, that doesn't mean that we should frown upon members of a different species necessarily. We should all accept that. But we are all the same species. And race is so hard to determine. And people who think themselves pure white probably go back in their lineage and have other races thrown in there. People who think themselves pure black, definitely, if they trace back their heritage, most people, 90% of people, do have ancestors that do not share their same racial line. So then when you think about that, and if we all have blood from multiple races inside of us, who are we to separate one race from the other? We are all the same, but we are also all different. And that is accepting our similarities and accepting our differences that makes us special as a human race, because we can live together if we only choose to, instead of focusing on our differences. But the differences are also important. It's important to study those differences to understand how evolution works and what makes us different from each other. And the root of all of that is in your genes, in your chromosomes. And we're going to be talking about that in this video lecture series.